Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Awaaz in Focus, an initiative of Azad Awaaz. This monthly patrika focuses on marginalized sections of the society whose voices are often muted in the cacophony of flashy mainstream media discourse. When talking about marginalization, this platform does not aim to only focus on caste, race alone, but also aspires to include discussions on class, gender identity, environmentalism, and more. This edition of Azad Awaz, we delve into the state's attempt to regulate public expression of desire and sex. Posing a fundamental question, why does the state seek to enforce such regulations? Understanding the tension from the lenses of prostitution in India. We wish to look at how the state positions sex workers and their profession through these regulations, whether these regulations are fulfilling its supposed aim to protect sex workers. For this episode of Awaaz in Focus, we are delighted to have Professor Bhavya Tandon part of the conversation. Professor Tandon is currently a professor from Jindal Institute of Behavioral Science. She graduated with an LLB from KIIT University and went on to practice as an associate advocate for a law firm. She then went on to pursue an LLM from University of Edinburgh. After her LLM, she soon came back to India to work as an associate advocate with advocate Arundhati Kajju, who is a renowned LGBTQ activist lawyer who practices in the Supreme Court. She has been awarded with Times Women's Strive Award in 2019 for raising awareness for LGBTQ plus rights. Professor Tandon largely works closely with the areas of sexual offences, women's rights, LGBTQ awareness, as well as rights of sex workers, which we will be talking about today. Currently, she takes two electives in Jindal Institute of Behavioral Science, which is popular among students. And both these electives look closely on these areas and closely focuses largely on sex workers and their rights and criminalization of sex workers. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us today for this conversation.
Thank you so much, Harshita. It's an honor to have this conversation with you, and I hope that it reaches wider audience outside my classroom or outside my very popular elective courses. So I think that's why I signed up for this. I really wanted to talk about it more. Yeah.
Yes, Professor. So, with that, let's get into the questions. So, the first question I wanted to ask you, Professor, is currently sex work is legalized in the country, yet there remains contentions against the profession as most citizens view the profession as an evil practice against the institution of marriage. Do you think the current legal framework surrounding the profession also is built on this very idea?
No, I don't think so, because let's look at the history of prostitution first before answering this question directly. Now, if you have to understand the history of prostitution in India, you have to first divide the history into three different categories. So there is pre-colonization, then there is colonization, and then there is post-colonization. All right. Now, when I say pre-colonization, that also includes your ancient history. And once you look at the research that is conducted and whatever that is documented, I won't say we have a lot of documented research right now. Jitna bhi hai, if you look at that, you will sort of realize that the conditions of these women who are sex workers or who are prostitutes, again, these are not interchangeable words, but let's stick to prostitutes only. If you look at the condition and the status of prostitutes back then to what it is right now, there is no doubt that the women back then actually enjoyed high status, right? Now, this is what I'm talking about ancient history. Now, ancient history, even if you look at the mythology, you will find that in Vedas also there is reference to prostitution that is being there. Now, not directly prostitution, but there are women who've been referred as, uh, they they are beautiful women, they are feminine women, and these women are well trained singers, dancers. They would perform for deities and gods. You will find references in pre-colonization as well, where historians have documented that prostitution is something that was scattered all across India, right? So, pehle it was nothing that was considered immoral. It was nothing that was evil that time, right? Now, what period we are talking about right now? Let's talk about pre-colonization, right? Now, similarly, during that period, if you look at the history of Europe or the other Western countries, the situation was quite different, rather quite opposite, right? Now, what was the situation back there was Wahan pe it was considered as a necessary evil, not even as an evil, but a necessary evil. Why necessary evil was the idea, the notion was that prostitution was required so that the men of the society can actually go out and, you know, something that is there to cater to their desires, sexual desires. And two main reasons, which is documented as of now, is one reason was to safeguard the, they safeguard the good Christian girls, so that these men, they do not come after the Christian girls. We require other women's, outside the homes, outside the families, who do not really come under the definition of good Christian girls. And the second major reason, which is documented, is to prevent the act of homosexuality. And that is why we say that in Europe, that time, in the 14th, 15th century, it was considered as a necessary evil. Hamare yahan, we did not even have the concept of brothels. We did not have the concept of red light area. All of it happened when the colonization happened, because when Britishers came, they brought in their laws and regulations, right? There was one regulation under the title of Contagious Disease Act, right? If you look at the title, Contagious Diseases Act, what do you think that the act would be about? Surprisingly, the act was about the women who was practicing sex workers, and to make sure that they're not spreading HIVs and other sexually transmitted diseases, right? Under that particular act, what the government was trying to do, basically all the Britishers were trying to do, was they were trying to compulsorily, medically examine these women who was selling sex. And to do that, they were isolating these women. And during that isolations, all these women were then sort of isolated to the area of what we know as red light district area. So, in Bombay, we have Kamatipura. It all started back then, right? So this is the history of Kamatipura. It all started with isolation under the British rules. So this is during colonization. And the third came post-colonization. Even though back then this particular the law was repealed, of course, because it was not only in India but other colonized country as well. They did repeal the act within 20 years, but it of course left some fragrance even in India after post-colonization. And I would say the current law, be it ITPA or CETA before this, right? It had a lot of traces of what these Britishers left in India, the idea of prostitution and sex workers. And secondly, it has a lot to do with the trafficking, right? India signed the international convention and they had to sort of abide by those international conventions. Now, international convention was in respect to human trafficking. और हमने confuse कर दिया इसको with prostitution as well. So if you look at the law in India, it does not really differentiate between human trafficking and the prostitutes. One law. And that one law is dealing with both the categories right now. So we do not differentiate between women who voluntarily want to sell sex, and we are not differentiating between the victims of these human trafficking. So I would not agree to your question and your proposition that it is an evil practice. It was never considered as an evil practice if you look at the history. It is all because of our international obligation. It is all because of the colonization that we have changed the narrative around these women. There was this concept of Devdasi system back then. It's even today. Now that's a great example. Why? Because back then Devdasis had a different reputation. If you break down Devdasi, that means that Dasi to the gods, right? So these were the women who were actually they were actually offerings which were being made in the temple. So they were taking care of the temple, performing all the rituals, right? They are basically women who were married to the deities. That was the status that was given to them. If you look at the current state of Devdasis, even though it's not there in India, but you can still find traces in the South India and few other villages in UP and MP. You will see that these are the women who are now merely poor women coming from very poor background, and now they are resorting to this. They are being exploited by the priest and other rich landlords in the villages. So this is the current situation. I think Devdasi is a very great example to understand what it was before colonization and what it is right now. But I hope this answers that why it is not an evil practice. It is considered evil practice because of the law that we have right now, right? Yeah.
Yes, Professor, that does make sense. In fact, I think the example you use with Devdasis is a very critical example, because previously it used to be something where only a section of women, or a respectful, it was almost a respectful act a woman would do for the day. She was a servant for God, and now it's mostly like when we see lower caste women being obligated to do it.
Yes.
So yeah, I
They've been
think
auctioned off. Yeah.
auctioned off. Yeah. So
Exactly. Yeah. So
yeah,
there is this. I'm sure you're from law school. You will understand the concept of constituent assembly debates, right? If you look at the Constituent Assembly debate, if you read the particular part where they're actually trying to understand what should be the position of prostitution in India, what should be the law, you will find that there are members who are trying to make a point that you cannot abolish prostitution in India because it is so deeply rooted. And if you try to abolish it, the entire thing will go underground. And this is exactly what happened. We,
Yeah.
even if we are saying that it is indirectly, if even if we are saying it is regulated, it is legalized, indirectly it is not, right? You cannot really practice because all the things surrounding it does not allow you to practice. And because of the law we have in India, entire thing has gone underground, and it is so difficult for these women to actually come forward and address their issues, right? I think if you look at the history, because there are very well points that were being addressed during the Constituent Assembly debate, and it was very surprising to know that a lot of these points were not only it has nothing to do with the conditions of women, the well-being of women. It was nothing to do about them. It was all about how do we protect the young generations, right? So you can then understand how the narrative shifted from protecting these women to protecting the young generation of these, young minds from entering into this field. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it definitely does make sense. And talking about constitutional debate itself, I think we can connect it a little closely to language of how the country has viewed this. So, moving on to the second question, the Law Commission of India's 64th report on the suppression of immoral traffic in women and girls act 1956 is a very interesting report on implementation of the act, and worldly viewing the profession in is professed in the report as well. The report states how the profession itself is immoral and is corrupting the institution of marriage and culture, but practically fully preventing it to happen in the possible. Therefore, there must be regulations. Do you think the language of the form of the viewing of the profession in the report really embodies how regulations are laid out for sex workers?
I think the language sort of addresses how the people of India, views this profession. You cannot shift that narrative. You cannot change public's opinion about it. You have to cater to the understanding. As of now, if you ask anyone outside, you will understand that their idea of prostitution is very different than ours, right? For them, it is something that is wrong, that is something that's immoral. I think that is what the law is also trying to do. The language that the law is using, they are trying to use this concept as known as harm reduction approach, right? The idea, if you look at the report, if you look at the law, you will understand that the harm reduction is it's basically done either by reducing the harm that the entire institution might have on the society at large. That is the intention, right? But if you look at the on-ground reality, if you look at the implementation, you will understand that it is not even trying to address the harm these women are being subjected to because of law that we have in India. So the question is this entire approach helping these women or suppressing these women? I always talk about this particular approach with my students in the class because who are these people who are drafting these reports? Who are these people who are drafting these laws, right? Are these men? Are these people? Mostly these are men. Let's be honest about it, right? All these are men with their own narrative, with their own notions about what exactly is sex work, how exactly women should be treated, right? And when you read SITA, when you read ITPA right now, the entire question is who are these men who are drafting these laws? Because these are not the laws which is there to protect the rights of these women. Rather, it is pushing these women so underground, so under the shadow that they do not even know what exactly are their rights right now. They don't know how to come out, how to address their problems, because human trafficking is not the only way that these women are entering this particular sex work industry, right? The two other major reasons is a poverty, and the second is tradition, right? Poverty being the number one cause. And without addressing the number one cause, how can you say that all these women who might also be entering voluntarily are the victims of sex workers? So I think this is where the language problem is. And I mean, I will address later also that there is a huge gap when it comes to implementation and the law that we have in India right now. And it's a very vicious cycle. Why? Because what the law is trying to address is the what exactly is the mentality of Indians right now towards sex work. And I would also blame the law for that, right? Because we have that law, we sort of perceive that sex work is immoral because हमारे यहाँ तो allow नहीं है ना ये सब, right? So it's working both ways. Law cannot change because the mentality is not changing, and the mentality won't change because the law is not changing. So how do we come to a middle ground? So I think that's why it's important to address how are we looking at the picture? Are we looking from all, holistic approach, or are we just looking at the very narrow approach that this is what the law says, so we have to stick to this particular law? Yeah.
Yes, Professor, I do think the Law Commission's report and the language itself again feeds into the idea also, and also maybe the fact that there is a more, because when it comes from the Law Commission and there is such an authority taking such a stance, it could also rather feed into the notion of not accepting it further.
Yeah, it
Um,
increases the stigma, right? It increases the
right.
stigma. And once you start attaching a stigma to one sort of profession, not understanding that it's a profession, right? Similar to any other skill. Similar, it should be treated under the concept of labor law, but why are we not doing it?
Yeah.
Because यहाँ पे women are involved who are selling their body. That's something which is not acceptable by men of the society, right?
Yeah.
So that's the biggest question, yeah.
Again, now looking a little deeper into ITPA, the act. So looking at ITPA, majorly it criminalizes third-party facilitation of prostitution. The emphasis is majorly on punishing clients, pimps, brothel owners, and renters. With the current framework, it leaves many confused on the kind of stance that the framework has taken on this profession. A part of exploitation is regulated in the ITPA, but what do you think are the lacks in the act, and do you think they still remain? Do you think there still remains a dangerously unrecognized and unregulated?
See, if you read the preamble of ITPA right now, it says that to sort of inhibit or abolish the commercialized vice, human trafficking in India, right? Human trafficking of women and girls in India. So the entire purpose of this act was to address the human trafficking part. And now what we are doing is we are mixing both the concept, which is the first gap you can identify in the one of the major default in the act is आप एक law से you're trying to address two major issues in India, and they are two separate complex issues. And if under analysis we draw a line, we understand that all the victims of human trafficking are not the sex workers, or rather, all the sex workers are not the victims of human trafficking. I think that is where we will be addressing a lot of the problems these women are facing. Right now, if we have to go section wise of the entire ITPA, you have correctly mentioned that when it comes to brothel keeping, when it comes to landlord, when it comes to other clients, customers, all these are criminalized, whereas selling is not really a problem in the under current law. Now, my first question to you is: let's say if the law says that you cannot run a brothel in within its premises, you cannot run a brothel, right? So, do you expect these women to go out independently and lease a property and conduct all of their business in private, alone, individually? Do you think that is possible in India? No. Why? Because with brothel, a lot of security also comes into the picture. In a brothel, there are a group of women who are living together in one particular, let's say, in one particular building, right? They're one particular institution, they're living together, they're working together. That means there are groups of women with their family living. If you look at the pictures also, you will see brothels are what exactly like they are like a huge space, and the rooms are allotted where they might be living alone, they might be living with their families, whatever. But if you are saying that the entire institution of brothel is criminalized, then you are expecting these women to separate themselves with the brothel owners and the brothels and practice this independently. Why this is problematic is because what happens with the security part? When there's a police raid that happens in the brothel, there is a relationship between police and the brothel owners. And a lot of time, brothel owners are being able to pay off the police. They are able to bribe off the police, and that's why police does not really interfere a lot when they are getting the money out of the entire business. Now, the moment you are separating these women from the brothels, you are taking over the security. B, you are putting them in a very complex position because now they have to rent out the property directly from the landlord, right? There might be a clash there. There might be exploitation there with the landlords, right? Because वहाँ पे landlords will question कि why exactly do you want to rent the property for what purposes? So वहाँ पे there will be one exploitation that will happen. Thirdly, when it comes to the police exploitation, we are not really sure whether or not these women would be able to address that problem, could say or not, because they don't have that security of the brothel owners, of the manager, or the other women. They will now have to deal with this police officer alone and separately. That is the one major issue with the law. When you say that brothels is not really permitted under the law, so where do you want them to practice? Because let's be honest, you cannot eradicate the practice. You cannot abolish the practice. Even if you try to, they will continue to thrive, right? So brothel wala section does not make sense because we can't really you either you tell them ki, okay, we will now give license to the brothels. That could be one way to do it, or you let it be, because the second option of taking out the women out of the brothel does not make sense under Indian under scenario. The second section, let's say there's a section which deals with family earnings, right? That you cannot live off the family of earnings of a prostitute. How are you addressing the one major reason why women enter this industry? That is poverty, right? So how are you not looking into the fact that these women are going out earning money for the entire family? Even though the law says that children who are under the age of 18 or 16 can actually live off the money of their mothers, but even if, what about the parents? What about the husband? What about the in-laws? Other members of the family as well? So why are you criminalizing that aspect of it, right? I mean, intention could be different, but I think when it comes to implementation, sir, there's a huge gap which has to be addressed. Similarly, the law also gives a lot of power to the police to search without warrant, right? Now, this is very problematic because if you look at the videos and pictures which is out there in media, you will see how the police raid actually happens. Yeah, these women who are dragged out of the hotels, dragged out of the brothels, and they don't know their rights. They don't have access to justice. They don't know how to address their problem in the courtrooms. And I'm sure you know how it is, right? Once they are into the prison and then they're taken before the magistrate, they're mostly clueless because they don't have legal representation. Then they end up in the correctional home. Wahan pe they end up for more than 7 months, 7 to 8 months. No clue what is happening inside the correction home. What is the facilities being granted to them? Nobody knows, right? And after correctional home, then either they have the option to go back to the society, do something about it, which is again questionable because you will be questioned each and every time, what were you doing prior to this? And then you have to answer that you were in sex industry, and no one would want to hire you in any profession. So eventually you will go back to the sex industry, you will go back to the brothels. Wahan pe it will be again difficult for you to re-enter because now you have already had a reputation with the police officers. So this is an entire vicious cycle that will keep on happening because the law does not address the actual problem. The actual problem is poverty, and the actual problem is unemployment. And these women who end up in this industry voluntarily, I'm not talking about the victims of the human trafficking, that's a completely different situation. We're not going into that area. We are talking about these sex workers, these prostitutes who are sort of earning money. So until and unless we address that issue, we cannot really sort of address other problems that is there with the law. Yeah.
Yes, Professor, that does make a lot of sense. And also, I think the point that you emphasized on how police, the way that they conduct these raids are often just unregulated, and it's like it's just not in the right way. And it's also like these women are always subjected to police brutality and a lot of shame that comes
Yes.
with.
Yeah.
So I think the next question I wanted to focus on is that the Supreme Court legalized the profession in the case Buddev Karmaskar versus the state of West Bengal. The judgment also brought emphasis on police force treating sex workers fairly and acknowledging their complaints. But in truth, police brutality and exploitation is heavily sparred on the group. Why do you think that this still occurs even after sex workers should be protected under ITPA?
See, first of all, in 2022, the Supreme Court not really legalized it. It sort of laid guidelines, right? Now, they just established guidelines acknowledging that sex workers are, it's a legitimate profession under the Constitution of India, under Article 1.2 of the Constitution of India. Now, following these guidelines, you will find similar judgments by the different high courts and session courts that now the courts are actually recognizing that, okay, sex workers are engaging in sex work is not a criminal offense under ITPA, which is true, right? If you read the law, it does not really say that the women who practices should be criminalized or should be penalized in any form. However, it just makes it difficult. It makes them impossible for them to actually practice. And the problem here is that this is the judgment which just lays down the guidelines, right? Now, these guidelines are subject to overturning anytime because these are not permanent, these are temporary guidelines. And any day they can be overturned by the central government by their discretion. So, until and unless we have a very strong law, we have a change in ITP, if we have amendment, we will continue to see the exploitation. Not only from the police brutality, if you there is a very renowned professor, Professor Prabha, and she has done immense work in the field of sex work, and she's published a lot of work as well. And she has addressed the issue of exploitation in a different scenario. She suggests that there are different stakeholders when it comes to sex workers. And for example, there are landlords, there are clients, there are brothel owners, and there, of course, there are police officers as well. So when you look at the exploitation perspective, right, these exploitations are not only come from one stakeholders, so they are overlapping, right? So these women who are being exploited by their clients, by their customers, by their brothel owners, and also by the police brutality, right? So we cannot just say that just because now that we have a ruling, we have a guidelines, the situation will improve. No, I'll tell the major reason is because these women do not know about their rights. They don't know what's happening, right? They don't know. And why they don't know? Because the law really does not address their problems. In India, because we have a very gray law, right? We are, it's neither regulated, it's neither criminalized or decriminalized. It's somewhere in between, right? We have to look beyond that. We have to understand what are the different models being followed in different countries. Even though I agree that in India, the population is huge and changing the notion around sex worker overnight will be impossible, right? And because until and unless you change the notion, the brutality wala part will not be addressed because people will keep exploiting these women because for them, they are sex workers, right? Let's say most of them would not end up in court. Now that we have guidelines, if they end up the court, hopefully the court would pass judgment in their favor. But prior to this, every time there is a case in the court and there is a woman who has been raped and she belongs to a sex work industry, you know what would happen, right? What would be the credibility of a testimony? And now that we have the guidelines, we hope that the courts now listen to these women. But the problem is these women would not even come to the courts. They would not want to address the problem, right? Because they don't want to be under the limelight. The moment they come into the limelight, their brothel managers will be, prosecuted. Their family members will be prosecuted. Their kids will be taken into the consideration. So they have to think a lot before doing that. So until and unless that is sorted, until and unless the law changes, unless there's an amendment in the law, we cannot expect any sort of exploitation from either of the stakeholders to come to any sort of conclusion. Yeah.
Yeah, so talking about the lack of recognition of this profession itself in law and the buildability of law and regulations to actually empower the profession. The next question I wanted to ask is, as stated earlier, there remains many unregulated parts of IT pay, and one essential one being stating the need of consent for empowering a sex worker's sexual autonomy. Currently in ITPA, there remains no mention of what is consensual and what is not consensual sex work. Is this a problematic approach? Why do you think consent as an understanding with sex work regulation doesn't exist?
See, when it comes to consent and non-consent part, the question is ki whatever happens in a very private space, right? So although the entire situation is very complex, it's very oppressing, but there is a very lack of reliable data. We don't have data in respect to consent in sex work. Why? Because the amount of violence these women are facing, we sort of only stick to, okay, there is physical violence involved, there is psychological violence involved, there is sexual violence also involved, of course, right? But it's very difficult to address whether or not consent is present or not. हमारे पास data नहीं है देखने के लिए. We don't even know where, if at all, these women actually their consent is being taken into consideration before actually entering the practice, right? So जब consent की बात आती है, there is of course risk involved in this entire industry, and I think these women are aware of, right? And consent is not only with their clients but also with their partners. If you read the literature, you will find interviews where the men, where the husband, where the partners are sort of acknowledging for the fact that she is a sex worker, we do not really care about her consent. She is a sex worker. Is it okay? It is okay to physically assault her. My wife is a sex worker. It is okay to take her money and go out drinking and then come back and beat the shit out of her. So यहाँ पे the entire problem is कि how do we address the consent and non-consent part in the industry, which is not really well regulated in India? How do we expect these women to come forward and say, okay, I was raped, my consent was not taken to the picture, right? If at all we have a regulation at a first place, let's say if you look at the law that is there in Netherlands, right? वहाँ पे they all the brothel owners, they have to apply for license, and then they have to maintain that, right? You have to make sure that your brothel comes and follows all the guidelines and regulation that is established by the government of Netherlands, right? Then only you will be given the licenses. We don't have any such provisions in India, right? So until and unless we have something like that, we cannot expect these women to actually come forward and talk about it. I think that's the problem. And unless we change the law and it'll be amended, there's no point of consent. I mean, of course, they can come under IPC. They can say, okay, I was sexually exploited, I was raped. But do you think they would come forward? No. And unless they come forward, we do not have data. We do not have research. We do not have reliable, resource to even talk about it, to even discuss about the concept of consent. It's a very far-fetched concept right now. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also the lack of the law itself also starts manifesting into their own belief that because I'm in sex work, does my consent even really exist? Because a lot of them, because of the way the framework is laid out, and also how, like you said, they don't even have consent as a acknowledgement from their partners. That value
Yeah.
doesn't exist, so they don't manifest it for themselves. Um,
Okay, I want to bring out one very interesting thing. So in Sweden, there is this model which is being followed. Okay, it's very opposite to what we have in India. So in India, if you read the law, it says that you cannot really purchase. It indirectly says that you can't be a client, right? Similar to a Nordic model, what happens is like it's okay to sell, but the moment, and of course the laws are very strict in Sweden. So under Nordic model, what happens is you cannot purchase sex, right? So let's say if you are the consumer, and in that case, if you look at the supply and demand ratio, if there are five sex workers, right, and if there is only one person who's ready to purchase sex under the law, which is very strict, you cannot purchase sex. वहां पे, do you think these women really care about consent? All they care about is that they have to go out and make money, right? And you will find interviews where these sex workers are actually saying that because they do not have, customers and clients coming forward, they even consent to having sex without condoms because they don't have any other options, right? Similar to in India, if these women are they out there to earn money, do you think consent really matters to them? Because in their head, they are sex workers, they are merely selling their body. And I think that we are also at fault, society at large is fault, because we sort of demean the entire profession. We don't look at sex industry as a profession at all, right? We just look at these women who are just selling out their bodies. So I think that is also major. I think when it to change the notion around and sort of separate stigma from this entire institution, the entire sex work industry, they will not talk about consent all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. So moving on to the next question, like we talked about sex workers, they're a very vulnerable group. Another vulnerable group that stems out from this profession and this area is also children of sex workers. Children of sex workers are often the innocent victims of violence, punishment, and humiliation by the society. Does the current legal framework protect children of sex workers in any way? If so, how?
See, it does, because we do have provisions. We do have provisions talks about providing education, providing rehabilitations under IPC, under ITPA. We have POXO also, right? We have JJ Act as well. But of course, the ground reality is very different. There is this documentary called Born into Brothel. It's a 2004 documentary directed by this director, Zana Brisky. She is an American director. And she has, even though it is in 2004, but I'm sure it's still very much relevant in today's situation as well. She has documented the children of Sonagachi. What she did in the entire documentary, she gave them cameras, okay, and she taught them photography. So you look at the document, you watch the documentary from the eyes of these children, right? So imagine all these children going around the brothel with a camera, and what exactly are they seeing? So she documents that, and the film also document what is the perception of uh, girl child in the family compared to the man child, right? The male child will be pushed to go out, to go study, go to school, go to education, whereas the female child will not be, really encouraged to go out and read. Whereas because she knows herself, she knows that she will end up in the industry, right? In the documentary, even though the filmmakers they tried to, give all these children admission in nearby schools, send them for boarding, but most of the girls who were involved in this particular documentary, they were called back to the homes. Why? Because they were needed back there, right? So these girls, I'm addressing only women right now because I think girl child is more prone to such exploitation compared to the male child. So girl child, she has all the responsibility, right? She will take care of the grandparents that is there. She will take care of the parents. She has a responsibility to go out and earn money as well, not just by selling, but by doing other household work. She will go and work for somebody else. So she has that responsibility, and somehow it is very indebted to in them. They will eventually end up in the same situation where their mother is right now. Whereas if the situation is very different, not very different, I think in most of the cases it's different compared to the male child. With the male child, even in the film, you will see the male child was actually encouraged to go out, read, study, and whatever. Whereas the female child are very discouraged. So we have NGOs at place, we have a lot of organizations who are working towards the education aspect, towards the rehabilitation aspect, towards the legal awareness aspect, and we just hope that it's actually being implemented in real life as well. I mean, I think it all looks very good on paper when you read research paper. Okay, there are organizations who are working, there are people who are talking about it, but what about actual representation? Is it actually happening for these children? The law says, of course, I'm not saying we don't have law. We have ample provisions which talks about their rights. We have JJ, we have IPC, we have POXCO Act, which penalize. It's all criminal law I'm talking about, right? So yes, we do have legislations, we do have, and now, but I'm not really sure about the implementation part. Like there could be gap when it comes to the gender. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think a lot of the conversation I've seen regarding children of sex workers, I've not seen the distinction of gender as much.
Yeah.
And I don't even think the laws really distinguish gender. And
No,
I think
no,
it's a
no.
big gap.
Yeah.
So that is very interesting to hear. So moving on to our last question. In a research report of human rights violation on victims of trafficking conducted by Social Active Forum of Manav Adhikar, it was seen that most sex workers were unaware of the laws and regulations pertaining to their profession. This was something that you had also mentioned earlier, Professor. So, do you think that this aids into many rooted issues sex workers face, such as discrimination, forced into joining corrective homes, and more?
Yes, I've already mentioned, of course, yes, because they don't know what are their legal rights. They don't know how to approach police when they are raped, when the consent is absent. You don't know when they are being exploited by the brothel owners or by their partners or by their clients or customers. Where do they go to? Because even if they, let's say, if they go to police officers, that there are high chances that they will be exploited in the police officers as well, in the police station as well. So I think that is a major problem. And how do we address? That's the second question, right? How do we address this problem? See, I'm not really sure we can say that these women have a lot of rights. Why? Because to be very honest, if you read the law, you can say that these laws were drafted without taking into consideration the voices of the marginalized women. You can see that their voice is completely absent from the law. And what can we do, right? What has to be done right now is we have to start looking outside India. We have to start looking into different models right now. I can guarantee that if you look at the Netherlands right now, Netherlands have a very regulated approach. They have license. It will not work in India. Why? Why it will not work in India? Because once you regulate the industry, it means that the state is interfering, right? The moment the government comes into the picture, the police officers will come into the picture. But the moment you give them the power, there are high chances that these people who are at power will exploit the power, right? So I am very much sure that the regulation cannot work in India. We cannot give that much power to the state or to the police officers in India when it comes to these marginalized, these vulnerable women, see these vulnerable class of women. Second option is, can we look into the Nordic model then? Right? Do you think Nordic model will address the issue? I don't think so. Why? When it comes to supply and demand, I think there will always be demand, there will always be supply, right? There will always be people who will be willing to purchase sex, and there will always be female women who will be willing to sell sex, be it because of tradition, be it because of poverty, be it because of human trafficking. But I would like to, of course, again, I want to like to mention this again. We should not confuse between the victims of human trafficking and prostitution. Yeah, when whatever we are the conversation right now is happening is only happening in respect to the women who have entered the sex work industry voluntarily, right? unke khali rights ko we can address, because other than that, we do have law which talks about the victims of human trafficking. We have to understand what about the rights of these other women who are voluntarily selling their body for money, right? Because monetary gain is the major concern here, the major reason here, right? So how do we remove that legal barrier? That's the second question. So if you, there was a study which was conducted in India that what about the rights and the lives of prostitutes in India when it comes to under the anti-trafficking laws in India, right? And the research has revealed that, because so much power is given to the police officers under the current law, they have misused it, right? The way they have exploited it, the way the women who are treated as the victims of human trafficking, how they are being treated by the police officers, by the brothel owners, right? So the third model after Netherlands, after Sweden, then comes a third model, right? That is a decriminalization model, which I believe that something can be actually done out of this. Why? Because this is the only model which actually considers the voice of these women. They give them the power to address their own problems. They give the power to frame their own rules and regulations and to regulate the industry just like the way it is regulated by any other. For example, let's say uh, what is the need, what is the need to regulate this industry? Do you think there is a need, right? Secondly, even if you are regulating, are you taking into consideration what these women are actually asking, right? I think until and unless we have a very solid data, we have a very solid research done on the ground of decriminalization, and we have to go down, we have to go on field, we have to ask these women, do you think decriminalization will work? You have to explain to them how this will be different from regulation and legalization, right? These are three different concepts. Deregulation is very different than what we understand of legalization, right? Legalization is again giving power to the state, whereas deregulation or decriminalization is completely sidelining the state, sidelining police officers from this industry. So I think that is something that we can address. This is the only way to go forward. Is the only possible way to go forward is like we need to start looking into different countries and then maybe understand what is a other situation out there. I think we can learn a lot from New Zealand right now and understand, how can we sort of listen to these women? What about their rights? What about these freedom rights of the women who have voluntarily entered the industry? Yeah.
So I think we have concluded. I think we can conclude this discussion because we have looked at several aspects of the law and lacks of the law and how the law itself interprets and looks at these look at women in sex work and how that further aids into the social viewing of these women. So with that, thank you so much, Professor, for taking part of this interview. And also for our viewers, if you are interested to read more, you can see the transcript of this interview in our magazine, in our website. And also we have also covered different other sections, and we have done podcasts which you can view in our magazine as well. So thank you so much, Professor, for joining us. And everyone, we will see you in the next episode.
Thank you so much, Harshita.
Thank you.
Is a